There is a kind of silence that belongs only to metal as it cools, and an 11-year-old girl with foundry loam grayed into the hem of her frock had learned to wait inside it the way other children waited for sleep. The tenor bell stood breast high in the gloom of the casting house at Hollow Cross, newly drawn from its pit, its dark bronze still ticking faintly to itself as the heat went out of it, and the long Suffolk afternoon leaned gold through the unglazed window holes and laid bars of light across the loam floor. Honora Vane pressed her ear flat to the cold lip of it. Her two small hands braced against the curve, and she did not breathe. Somewhere above her in the rafters a swallow shifted. Somewhere outside, beyond the yard of rejected bells with their chalked faults, a cart went by on the witching road, and a man called to his horse, and none of it mattered, because the bell was speaking to her in the way that bells spoke before ever an iron touched them. A thread of a note buried so deep in the body of the metal that you felt it more in the bone of your jaw than heard it in your ear. She held it, turned it over against her teeth, and then she straightened and wiped her cheek with the back of one grubby hand and said, "Into the dimness it will come up sharp. A whisker above the strike. You will want to take it at the sound bow, uncle, not the waist." For a long moment nothing answered her but the cooling tick of the bronze. Then a shape detached itself from the deeper dark by the molding boxes. A broad, gruff man in a leather apron scorched brown across the belly, with gray wiring out of his eyebrows and forearms like the limbs of an oak, and master founder Gideon Vane came forward into the bar of gold light and looked at the bell and not at the child, which was his way of looking at her most kindly. He set his own blunt thumb to the sound bow, the thick lower rim where the clapper would one day strike, and he was quiet, and then he grunted, which from Gideon was a kind of music in itself. "Sharp," he agreed. "A whisker, at the sound bow." He did not say "well done," because he did not believe a true thing required congratulation, any more than the sun required thanking for rising. But he did not send her out either. He never sent her out. Other men's nieces were got rid of when the real work began, swept off to the kitchen and the needle, but Gideon Vane let his brother's orphaned daughter stand at his elbow through the pour and the cooling and the long patient labor of the tuning, and he let her keep his books, because she could already do a thing that not one journeyman in 40 could do, and not one gentleman in all the county could do at all. She could name a bell's true note before the tuning iron ever bit it. "Set it down," he said now, jerking his chin at the slate where the day's casting was tallied. "Tenor, Hollow Cross, 2nd August. Mark it sharp at the bow." And she went, light as the swallow overhead, to do it, and the gold light held them both a moment longer, the gruff old man and the loam-hemmed child, before it slid off the wall, and the day went on into evening and into all the years that were coming. The years that were coming were not kind, and the gold light did not follow her into them. It was 19 years later, midsummer of 1817, and the woman who had been that child sat very straight at the foot of a long mahogany table in the dining room of her cousin's house in Witching Magna, in a gown of dove-gray half-mourning that had been turned twice and let out once, and was clean and pressed and entirely without hope, with a single small brooch of polished jet at her throat for her only ornament. And she was being, as she was every day of her life now, perfectly and silently useful. Honora Vane was 27. Somewhere in the long erosion between the casting house and this table, she had become the thing that genteel families keep in a back bedroom and an apologetic tone: the poor relation, the dowerless spinster, the companion. She lived in the house of her cousin Mrs. Drusilla Pellew, and Mrs. Pellew's husband, the cloth merchant Mr. Septimus Pellew, and she earned the bread she ate at their table by 100 small unpaid labors that no one named, because to name them would have been to admit she was owed a wage. She kept the household accounts in a hand so neat the wine merchant complained he could no longer pad his bills. She taught the 2 Pellew daughters to draw a tolerable rose and a worse spaniel, and to sit at the pianoforte without disgracing the family. She mended. She read aloud through Drusilla's headaches. She listened endlessly, with a stillness people mistook for emptiness, to the talk that flowed over her as though she were a piece of furniture that had learned, troublingly, to pour the tea. "Honora, the cruet," said Drusilla now, without turning her head, in the voice one uses to a well-trained dog, and Honora rose and fetched it and set it at her cousin's elbow and sat down again. And not one of the dozen guests marked that she had moved, except the one who marked everything. For this was a dinner of some county consequence. Septimus Pellew had risen in the world on the back of broadcloth and ambition, and he was at pains on such evenings to gather under his roof the sort of people whose notice he prized and whose contracts he coveted. And the center of the table that night, the sun about which the lesser candles arranged themselves, was a tall, fair, smiling man of perhaps 32, named Mr. Aurelian Stourton. He was the heir, through his late father, to the great corn Stourton estate that lay along the western edge of the parish. He was handsome in the smooth, unweathered way of a man who has never once doubted that a door would open before him, and he was, just at present, the talk of 304 parishes, because he had lately undertaken, at his own expense, and to the glory of his ancient name, the restoration of the celebrated antique peal of bells at the church of St. Botolph, that famous ring of 5 which the county antiquarians held to be among the oldest sweet-tuned peals in all the eastern shires, cast, so the brass plate in the tower averred, so the learned men nodded, in the 14th century, when Corn Stourtons had first held the land. He spoke of the bells beautifully. He spoke of everything beautifully. He had a way of laying his hand flat upon the cloth and tilting his fair head when he listened that made the person speaking feel, for the length of a sentence, like the only soul in the room, and then made them feel, when his eyes moved on, the cold of the place where the warmth had been. "And is it true, Mr. Stourton," cried Miss Lavinia Pellew, pink with the daring of it, "that the great bell, the tenor, is above 400 years old?" "It scarcely seems possible a thing so old should ring true. It is the marvel of it, Miss Pellew," said Stourton, turning the full sun of his attention upon her so that she nearly upset her glass. "4 centuries and more, and yet I am assured by the gentlemen of the society that the tone is unimproved by the passage of ages. They are a relic, a living relic. One does not so much repair such bells as kneel before them." A soft laugh went round the table at the prettiness of it, and the talk turned to the great work he was doing, and to the antiquity of his name, and to the charter. Honora caught the word, and was not sure, afterward, why it caught, the ancient charter, lately come to light among the muniments at Corn, by which the Stourtons of old had held certain rights over Witching Fen, that great wet sweep of common grazing where the poor freeholders of 3 villages turned out their geese and their thin cattle and cut their winter peat. There was something coming, was the drift of it, something orderly and improving and modern. The fen, men said, was to be enclosed. It was perhaps inevitable that the sun should at last swing round to her. Drusilla, in the small cruelty that was her habitual weather, had been waiting for it. "You must not mind my cousin's silence, Mr. Stourton," she said brightly into a lull. "Honora is a vein, you know, of the Bell-Foundry veins, though I dare say there is little enough left of that now. Her uncle keeps a foundry somewhere out toward Hollow Cross. Keeps, I should say. I believe it is more rust than trade these dozen years." She gave the little laugh that meant a knife had been put in. Honora was quite brought up among the bells. Were you not, my dear, quite the little Smith? Every face turned to her, briefly amused, ready to be charmed by the spectacle of the poor companion got up as a curiosity, and Honora felt the old heat climb her throat and stopped it where it was, as she had learned to stop everything. I learned a little of the trade as a child, sir, she said quietly. From my uncle. How singular, said Staunton, and smiled, and looked at her for the first time, and she understood at once that he had ranked her in the half-second of the look, weighed the turned gown and the single jet brooch and the 27 years and the absence of any portion, and filed her where such women were filed. And do you keep up the accomplishment? I confess I had not thought it an art that could be carried in a lady's reticule. Another soft laugh. He did not mean it unkindly, which was somehow worse. Unkindness would at least have granted her the dignity of an enemy. You must tell me, Miss Vane, for I am, as you hear, become quite the enthusiast. Is it true what they say, that a true founder can tell a bell's age by its very note? She might have said yes. But she looked at the smiling fair man who held the table in his soft hand, and she saw that whatever she said would be a small dancing dog's trick to him, performed and applauded and forgotten, and so she folded it all away into the place where she folded everything, and said only, "Some can, sir, I should not presume so far," and lowered her eyes to her plate. And Aurelian Staunton said how charming and turned the sun away, and the talk moved on, and she was furniture again, and the candles burned down, and that, she thought, was the whole of her future laid out before her like the long polished table, to be useful and silent and slowly worn until there was nothing left of the loam-hemmed child but a clean gray gown and a jet brooch and a hand too neat for the wine merchant. The letter came 4 days later, brought up the back stairs with the morning's other post, and Drusilla read it at the breakfast table and made a sound and set down her cup. "Well," she said. "Well, your uncle is dead, Honora, the old man at Hollow Cross. They found him a Tuesday in the casting-house, quite cold. The woman that does for him went in, and there he was. A seizure, the letter says, or his heart." Alone, she refolded the paper with the brisk efficiency of a woman cataloging an inconvenience. "I suppose we shall all have to go into something dark for a week. There is the attorney to see, a Mr. Tench, in Witching. He writes that the will is to be read on Friday, and the family desired to attend." She glanced up, and a small bright speculation kindled behind her eyes, the look of a woman doing sums. It is to be hoped the old fool had something put by. He never spent a farthing in his life that I ever saw. Honora did not weep at the table. She had long ago lost the trick of weeping where anyone could see. But something went very still and very cold in the middle of her, stiller and colder than grief. Only the sudden, vertiginous knowledge that the one person on the earth who had ever once looked at her and seen a craftsman and not a charge, was gone into the dark of his own casting-house, alone, with no one to press an ear to the bell beside him. She asked to be excused. She went up to the cold back bedroom and sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her hands in her lap, and she did not cry, and after a while she found that she was thinking, absurdly, of the way he used to grunt instead of praising her, and she put her face in her hands at last. Mr. Caradoc Tench kept his chambers up a steep stair off the marketplace in Witching Magna, in 2 low rooms that smelled of dust and sealing wax and the cold mutton smell of the law, and on Friday the family assembled there in their hastily blacked clothes, the Pellus, Drusilla rigid with expectation and Septimus pulling at his stock. 2 further cousins down from Barry, who had not troubled to write to the old man in a decade, and, to Honora's slow surprise, seated a little apart by the window with his hat upon his knee, Mr. Aurelian Staunton himself. She understood it less when Mr. Tench, settling his spectacles, made a small bow toward the window and named the gentleman, for the benefit of the room, as attending in the character of a creditor, the estate of Hollow Cross standing, it appeared, in some small debt to the Corn Staunton interest, a matter of an old account. Staunton inclined his head modestly, as a man does who is too well bred to insist upon his own importance, and Honora looked at him sitting there so quiet and so attentive in the dead man's affairs, and felt, without yet having any name to put to it, the first faint cold draught of a thing being wrong. Mr. Tench read the preamble in the flat sing-song of his trade, the sound mind and the disposing memory and the all and singular, and Drusilla leaned forward, and Septimus stopped pulling at his stock, and then the attorney came to the matter of it, and the room went taut as a strung wire. To his nephews and to his niece, Mrs. Pellew, the will declared, and here Drusilla's chin came up, ready. Gideon Vane left such moneys and securities and household goods as should remain after his debts were satisfied, and there followed the reading of a sum. And the sum was so small, so very meanly and laughably small, the whole frugal hoard of a frugal lifetime come down to a few £100 in the funds, and a cottage's worth of furniture, that Drusilla's face went first white and then a slow climbing red, and Septimus made a sound low in his chest, and the cousins from Barry exchanged a look of pure disgust. And then Mr. Tench turned the page, and his voice changed by a fraction, became almost careful, and he said, "And to my niece Honora Vane, daughter of my late brother, I give and bequeath the foundry and yard at Hollow Cross, with all its buildings, fixtures, tools, molds, and the bells therein, cracked or whole, together with my iron chest and the whole of its contents, being my tuning ledgers, casting notes, and private papers, the only inheritance." And here the attorney paused, and read the dead man's words across the silent, dusty room. She will know how to read. For a moment no one moved. Then the room broke. Drusilla was on her feet. The buildings, the rust, the rejected bells, the worthless tumble-down ruin given to the spinster, while the family, the proper family, the family that had housed and fed and clothed the ungrateful creature, was put off with a beggar's pittance and a parcel of old chairs. Septimus was talking over her about going to law. The cousins were demanding to know the value of the funds. Mr. Tench was patting the air with both hands and saying that the will was sound. The will was witnessed. The will would stand. And through all of it, Honora sat very still in her turned gray gown, with her gloved hands folded in her lap, hearing almost none of it. Hearing instead the dead man's voice come up out of the page across 19 years, the only inheritance she will know how to read, and feeling the floor of her whole settled hopeless future tilt very slowly and silently beneath her, because he had not forgotten her. In the end, at the last, alone in the cold of the casting-house, he had not forgotten what she was, and he had reached back through all the dwindling gray years to put it into her two hands again, and she did not yet know whether what he had given her was a gift or a grave. And in the midst of the noise and the indignation, while the family raged about money, Honora's eyes went, almost by accident, to the quiet figure by the window, and found that Mr. Aurelian Staunton was not looking at the family at all, and was not thinking of the money. He was looking at the iron chest which Mr. Tench had brought up and set upon a side table, squat and black and banded and locked, looking at it with an attention so naked and so still, all the practiced grace gone out of his face for one unguarded moment, that it might have been the only object in the room. Then he felt her eyes, perhaps, for his own came round to her, and the smooth, pleasant mask dropped back over the thing beneath as swiftly and silently as a sluice gate falling, and he gave her a small, courteous, grave inclination of his fair head, the sympathy of one gentleman to a bereaved lady, and looked away. But Honora had seen it. She did not understand it yet, but she had spent her childhood learning to hear the one false note buried deep in a body of sound metal, and she filed the look away. Beside the word charter and the word enclosure and the cold small drought of wrongness, in the place where she kept things that did not ring true. They would not let her go out to the foundry that evening. It was unseemly. Drusilla said it could wait, but Honora went all the same, on foot, alone, in the long blue summer dusk, out along the witching road past the wool warehouses and the last cottages and over the little humped bridge, while the swifts cut the air above her and the light went out of the west by slow degrees. And at last the lane turned, and there it was below her in the gathering dark, just as it had stood in the gold of 19 years ago and in every year since, the long, low roofs of Hollow Cross, the muniment shed, the yard with its silent congregation of cracked and rejected bells leaning in the weeds, each with its chalk-scrawled fault gone gray with weather, and the great casting house with its black door standing open on the dark, and within it the cold cone of the casting pit going down into the earth, waiting, as it had waited her whole life, for metal and for fire, and for someone who could read the note before the iron. The dead man's gift. Her burden and her summons both. She stood at the head of the lane with her uncle's iron chest waiting for her in the dark, and the rumor of the fen and the smiling fair man's hungry look all turning slowly together in her mind. And she gathered her gray skirts in one hand, and she went down toward the open door. The key to Hollow Cross was a great cold thing of black iron, longer than Honora's hand and heavier than a spoon ought to have any right to be, and when she fitted it to the wicket gate the next gray morning, it turned with a groan that seemed to come up out of the ground itself. Mrs. Pellew had said a great many things at breakfast, none of them kind, and most of them concerning the indecency of a single woman of 27 taking up residence in a tumble-down manufactory among the lowest sort of working men, and Mrs. Pellew had said over the rim of his chocolate that Stourton would pay handsomely and quickly, and that a sensible woman would take the offer, and never set foot in the place at all. Honora had folded her napkin into its accustomed third and answered that the will named her, and that she meant to read what her uncle had left her to read before she sold so much as a nail of it, and the flatness of her own voice had surprised her. She had not known, until she heard it leave her, that she had stopped asking permission. So she had walked out before the household stirred, the dove-gray hem already darkening with dew along the fen path, and now the gate gave way under her hand, and she stood once more in the yard she had not properly entered in 16 years. It was smaller than memory and larger than sense. The casting house rose to her left, its slate roof sway-backed, its great doors barred. Before her stretched the yard, and in it, on their beds of nettle and dock, lay the bells. Cracked bells. Rejected bells. Bells that had come out of the pit sour or porous or sprung, that no parish would hang and no founder would own, and that Gideon Vane had hauled aside and never broken up for scrap as any other man would have done. Because she understood this now in a way she had not as a child. Because each one was a record, a failure he could learn from, a wrong note he refused to pretend he had not made. On the shoulder of the nearest, a heavy thing of mottled green-brown the size of a washtub, somebody's chalk had written in her uncle's blocky capitals a single word, half-weathered, short. On the next, flaw in cope. She moved among them slowly, the wet grass dragging at her skirts, and laid her ungloved palm against the cold curve of one and then another. And it was the most natural thing in the world, and the strangest, to be touching metal again, to feel the grain of the casting under her fingers and the faint sandy roughness of the loam that still clung in the lettering. She had forgotten she knew how to do this. She had spent 16 years forgetting, by main force, because there had been no profit in remembering, and here it all was, waiting in her hands. The casting house, when she had wrestled the bar from the doors and let the daylight in, smelled of what it had always smelled of: damp loam and old tallow and cold iron and the ghost of wood smoke, a smell so wholly her uncle's that her eyes stung, and she stood blinking in the doorway until the dimness resolved into shapes she knew. The casting pit, a great dark cone sunk into the floor, lipped with brick gone glassy from the heat of 100 pourings. The molding boxes ranged along the wall, the iron flasks in their sizes, the wheeled crane with its chain and its hooks, the strickle boards on their pegs, each shaped to sweep the curve of a particular bell. She could read the profile of a tenor in that one, a treble in the small one beside it. And the rack of tuning irons, the great scraping tools like monstrous chisels and hooks and gouges, with which a founder pared metal from the inside of a finished bell, a whisper of bronze at a time, coaxing the 5 partial tones of it: the hum, the prime, the tierce, the quint, the nominal, into the true relation that made a bell sing rather than merely sound. She took down the smallest of them, a slender hooked scraper worn bright along its edge by her uncle's hand and his master's before him, and the balance of it in her grip was a sentence in a language she had been forbidden to speak. Against the far wall, beneath a square of oiled sailcloth, squat and patient as a toad, sat the iron chest. It took her the better part of an hour, and 3 of the keys from the bunch Tench had surrendered with such evident relief. But at last the lock gave, and the lid came up on a smell of dry paper and beeswax and old ink, and Honora sat back on her heels in the dust of her inheritance and looked at her uncle's whole life laid in courses like masonry. Ledgers, not one but a dozen, calf-bound, their spines lettered in his hand by years, the earliest cracked and foxed and dated before she was born. Bundles of casting notes tied in faded tape, a roll of strickle templates in stiff paper, a japanned box of the steel letter punches, and the founder's mark, the little crowned V that had gone onto the waist of every honest bell to leave the vain shops in 60 years. And the ledgers, when she drew the topmost into her lap and opened it across her knees, the present went out of the room like a snuffed candle. Here was a column for the parish, the dedication, the year of founding, the diameter and the weight to the quarter pound, and here, in a hand that grew firmer and then, in the last volumes, began to tremble, the thing no other founder in England troubled to set down: the alloy. Tin to copper, part by part, batch by batch, and against the common figure of 1 part tin to 4 of copper her uncle had again and again written his own richer proportion, a hand's breadth more tin, with the marginal note in his blunt shorthand: Gideon's bronze, sweeter in the upper work, dearer by the 100 weight, will not be cheated, and beside the alloy, the tuning. Not merely the note, the marks. For every bell he had founded, or she began to see, every bell he had ever been called to examine or rehang or repair across 2 counties, Gideon Vane had recorded the exact pattern of the tuning cuts filed into the sound bow, as particular as a signature, as a man's own hand, the depth and the placing of them, the way one master would take his metal high on the bow and another low, so that a bell, to one who could read it, told not only its note, but its maker, and very nearly its year. And threaded through all of it, in margins and between the ruled lines, a private cipher, dots and short strokes in clusters, a little constellation of them besides certain entries that meant nothing to her at all that first morning, except that her uncle had wanted it to mean nothing to anyone but himself. She did not hear the cart in the lane, nor the footstep in the yard, and so when the man's shadow fell across the open doors, she came to her feet with the ledger clutched to her breast. And there was an instant, the light behind him, his coat a dark column against the day, when she thought it was Staunton come for the chest, and the fear of that surprised her with its sharpness. But the man took off his hat at once, which Staunton would not have troubled to do for her, and said in a level, carrying voice, the voice of a man used to being heard across a deck in weather, "Forgive me." I knocked at the gate. There was no one to answer. He was perhaps 35, spare and weathered, with a stillness about the body that she would learn was the discipline of a man who had spent years not bracing visibly against a heaving floor. His coat was good but plain and a season out of fashion, and he carried a flat leather case under his arm, and his eyes, when they found her face and stayed there, were a clear gray that did not slide away from her as men's eyes commonly did when they had taken in the gray gown and the want of a ring. "Mr. Tobias Hartley," he said, "I am land agent and surveyor to Lady Corn, of Corn Staunton, the estate of which this foundry forms. I am instructed, a part of the chattels. I am sent to make an inventory." A small, scrupulous pause. I had not understood the place was occupied, or that it had passed. "I am at a disadvantage, and I ask your pardon for it." She told him her name, and watched it land, and saw this was the thing she would turn over afterward, lying sleepless on the truckle bed she had dragged into the warm corner by the cold furnace, that he did not file her under any of the headings she was used to being filed under. He did not look at her with the gallant pity reserved for distressed gentlewomen, nor the faint distaste reserved for women found in men's workshops, nor the bright false interest of a man calculating a connection. He looked at the ledger she still held against her, and then at the open chest, and then at the rack of tuning irons gleaming dully along the wall, and his still face did something at the corner of the mouth that was not quite a smile, but was a great deal like attention. "Then the place is yours, and not the estate's," he said slowly. "And my inventory is so much waste paper, and I have walked 4 miles to trespass on a lady." He looked again at the irons. "Master Vane's foundry. I had heard he was the finest Bell-Founder east of Whitechapel and a Tartar to deal with, and that he kept records no other man would keep, and that he is lately dead." He glanced back to her. "And that the records are come to a niece who could read a bell by ear before she could write. I had that last from his old laborer in the village this morning, and confess I doubted it. It was not a challenge. It was, she understood with a small interior shock, an inquiry made gravely, by a man who would believe the answer. "You may go on doubting it," she said, "or you may strike one of those bells in the yard and let me name its note with my back turned, and afterward you may apologize." She had not meant to say it. It had come up out of the same buried country as the flat new voice at breakfast, and she half expected him to take offense or to laugh, and he did neither. He set down his case on the molding bench with great care, as a man stows gear he means to come back to, and said, "I should like that very much," and went out into the yard. She heard him moving among the bells, the rustle of the grass, and then the dull, broken clank of a handstone against bronze. A cracked bell does not ring, it clunks. And she had picked the test as much to humble herself as him. And she stood with her back to the doors and her eyes shut, and the note came to her up through the soles of her feet as much as through the air, flawed and short-lived and unmistakable. G, she said, a little flat of G. And it is cracked through the sound bow, which you knew or you would have heard it ring on and not die. There was a silence from the yard, and then his footstep returning, unhurried, and when she opened her eyes he was standing in the doorway with the stone still in his hand and an expression on his weathered face that she would have called, in another man, something close to delight held firmly under guard. G. A shade flat, he said. There is a chalk mark on the shoulder, reading G and a fraction. I owe you an apology, Miss Vane, and a better opinion of village gossip. And then, after a moment, with the first warmth she had heard in him, almost shyly, a man asking for a thing he wanted and was not sure he had the right to. Will you teach me how it is done? Not the trick of it, the truth of it. How a man, how a person, makes a piece of metal tell the truth about itself. That was the beginning of it, and it grew through the slow gold of that fortnight in a way neither of them named, because there was honest work to make a frame for it. He came each day. He had, it emerged, a commission that suited the visiting. Lady Corn, very old and very far off in Bath, kept him to survey and report on the whole scattered estate, and the Foundry's disputed status gave him reason enough to be at Hollow Cross, while the lawyers argued whether it had ever truly been the estate's to leave, though Honora soon understood that the reason was a fig leaf, and that he came because here, for some hours of the day, he was permitted to be a serious man among serious things, and to talk to a woman who answered him plainly. He was a naval lieutenant on half pay. She had this in pieces, never asked for, dropped flat between two readings of the ledger as a man pays out a line. A brother lost, my brother William, the better officer and the better man, gone down off Finisterre when I was a midshipman, and could do nothing but watch the topsail go under. A court-martial, years after, not his own and yet his ruin, in which he had told a plain truth on oath against a well-connected captain, and had been believed by every honest man in the service, and advanced by none of them since. I learned, he said once, turning a strickle template in his hands without seeming to see it, that a smooth man with friends may say a thing is so, against the plain evidence of the instrument, and be thanked for it, and that a man who points at the instrument and says, "But look, the figures will not lie, that man dines alone," he set the template down. I find I have no patience left for the smooth sort. It is a defect in an agent. It is why I am an agent and not a captain. And Honora, who knew to the marrow what it was to point at the truth and be smiled at and set aside, said nothing, but bent again to the ledger and felt the silence between them turn from the silence of strangers into something with a current in it. She taught him as her uncle had taught her, by the hand. She put the small tuning iron in his grip and stood close to set the angle of it against the inner sound bow of a sound bell she had found among the rejects, sound in tone, cracked only in the cannons, useless to hang but true to ring, and showed him how a feather of metal off the wrong place would drop the prime and leave the nominal singing alone, a bell at war with itself. She made him hum the partials until he could pick the hum from the strike note, the deep ghost tone that lingers under a great bell after the bright voice has died. She showed him the marks, how to lay a straight edge across the bow and read the founder's filing as a chartmaker reads soundings, and how one master's hand differed from another's, and how, leaning over the ledger together, his shoulder a warm plane an inch from hers, both of them forgetting for whole minutes to keep the decorous distance, her uncle had set down those marks for bell after bell, parish after parish, the whole singing geography of Suffolk and Norfolk reduced to ruled columns and a private code. Hartley, who had the gift of records, took to it the way she had hoped and half feared he would, and it was he, in the end, who turned the talk where it had been quietly tending. "These clusters," he said one afternoon, his blunt finger hovering above a stipple of dots and strokes beside an entry for a bell at a parish she did not know. "They are not random. He has put them only against certain names. And see, they recur. The same little figure here, and here, and here." He looked up. "It is a mark, Miss Vane, a private mark. Your uncle was telling himself something about these particular bells that he did not choose to write in plain words. She had seen it. She had been circling it for a week, the way one circles a thought one is afraid to think, and she had not let herself draw the line between the dots, because the line led somewhere she had no wish to go. But she went out into the yard with him in the long, low light of that evening, the swifts screaming overhead, because she had remembered something, that among the rejected bells in the nettles there was one that did not belong with the others, a smaller bell, sweet-faced and barely marred, that her uncle had hauled here from somewhere and never explained, and that she had assumed in childhood was a foundling like herself. It bore, faintly cast into the waste under the verdigris, a date in the antique manner, and the name of St. Botolph's, the very tower whose celebrated ancient peal had made Mr. Aurelian Storton famous in the county for restoring it. She knelt in the wet grass with her skirts forgotten, and rubbed the lichen from the lettering with her thumb. And there was the date her whole childhood had been taught to revere. A date out of the 14th century. The date that hung in the village like a relic, and there was the founder's mark beside it. An antique stamp she did not know, and Honora took up the handstone and struck the bell lightly on the bow. It rang. It was not cracked. It rang out across the darkening yard, clean and full and lingering, and Hartley turned at the sound of it, and Honora felt the bottom go out of the evening, because she knew that note. She knew it in her body before her mind would consent to the knowledge, the timbre of it, the particular sweetness in the upper partials, the way the hum sat under the strike note. She had been hearing that signature all fortnight. It was the voice of her uncle's own metal, the richer alloy, the hand's breadth more of tin. It was Gideon's bronze, that he had begun mixing. The ledger said so. The dates in the earliest volume said so plainly. Within living memory, within 60 years, and a recipe of his own devising that no founder dead 4 centuries could possibly have known. A bell cast in the 14th century would ring older, harder, leaner. She had heard such bells. Her uncle had taught her their hungry, austere voices. This bell sang like something poured in her grandfather's lifetime, dressed in an old man's date. She let the note die. The yard was very quiet. "Mr. Hartley," she said, and her own voice was strange to her. Low and careful, the voice of a woman laying down a thing that might go off. "Bring me the ledger. The newest one. And the candle." He went without a word, and came back and held the light, and she found the page, and ran her finger down the column of St. Botolph's parish to the entry for the peal. And there, beside the famous, the revered, the unimpeachable ancient peal of St. Botolph's, on the strength of whose antiquity Aurelian Storton meant to prove a charter old enough to swallow the common fen. There, in her uncle's trembling final hand, was the cluster of dots and strokes, the false mark, the private cipher he had reserved for bells he knew in his bones to be lies. Gideon Vane had known. He had stood in that tower with his ear against that metal, and he had heard exactly what she had just heard, and he had come home and set the mark against it in a code no man could read. And then he had died alone in this foundry, before he could say the word aloud to a single living soul. And into her hands, only her hands, He had put the one ledger in England that could prove the holiest relic in the parish had been cast within the memory of men still drawing breath. The candle flame stood straight in the windless dark of the casting house. Hartley was looking at the page, and then at her face, and she saw in his still gray eyes that he had followed her the whole way, and arrived where she had arrived, and found it as cold a country as she did. "Miss Vane," he said quietly, "do you understand what you are holding?" And she found she could not yet answer him, because to answer would be to begin, and she could feel beneath the floor of that ruined, honest place the whole machinery of another man's ambition turning toward her, and she knew, the way she knew a note before the iron touched it, that from this evening forward she would either be believed or be destroyed, and that there was no third road out of the foundry yard at all. They fell into a manner of working that neither of them had planned, and neither would have known how to describe, had they been asked. In the mornings, before the dew had quite gone off the cracked bells in the yard, Mr. Hartley would come up the foundry lane on foot. He had given over riding, he said, because a man on foot saw the parish as the parish was, and he would bring with him whatever the surveyor's office had let pass through his hands the day before, a copy of a boundary award, a tracing of an old field map, a column of figures purporting to set down the rents of Witching Magna in some century, when there had been no such thing as a rent roll kept in that hand. And Honora would clear a corner of the long deal table where her uncle had once chalked his molds, and she would set out the ledger, and they would read together. It was not courtship. She told herself that with great firmness, in the small hours, lying in the narrow bed with the cold coming up through the floor and the owls going over the fen. Courtship was a thing that happened to other women. To the Pellew girls with their pianoforte and their muslin, it was not a thing that came up the lane on foot to a dowerless spinster of 27 in a gown gone shiny at the elbows. It was work. He treated it as work, and that was precisely the mercy of it, and she would not spoil the mercy by asking it to be more. She taught him the way she had been taught, which was to say by the hand and the ear before ever by the book. She brought him out to the yard one gray forenoon and stood him before the row of rejected bells. There were 9 of them, each on its bed of weathered oak, each chalked at the crown with her uncle's old fault marks, the spider-thin figures that meant cracked at the cannon, or porous in the bow, or false in the third. "Lay your hand flat to the waist of it," she said, "where the metal swells out before it turns under to the lip. Now I shall strike it, and you are not to listen with your ears at all. You are to feel it come up through your palm into the bone of your arm, and tell me whether it dies quickly or whether it goes on." He did as he was bid, this grave man who had stood on a heaving deck and given orders that sent boats away into the dark, and he closed his eyes against the December light, and she took up the little tuning iron and struck the bell a glancing blow upon the sound bow. The note went up thin and bright, and then, almost at once, soured, went flat and ragged and shivered itself out, where a true bell would have held its hum sweet and steady for the slow count of 30. She watched his face and saw the moment the wrongness reached him. "It goes on," he said slowly, "but it goes on wrong, as though 2 voices were in it and they cannot agree. That is the crack," she said. "You cannot always see it. Sometimes it is no wider than a hair and packed with green and grime, so the eye slides over it. But the metal cannot lie about a crack. The crack makes a second bell inside the first, and the 2 of them quarrel, and the quarrel is what you feel." He opened his eyes and looked at her with that particular attention she had grown, God help her, to wait for through the long gray hours of the household at the Pellews, the attention of a man taking down a true reckoning. "Then a bell cannot be made to lie," he said. "No," said Honora, "not the bell. only the men who hang it and the men who write its history. The bell tells the truth to anyone who will put a hand to it. That was my uncle's whole faith, I think. That whatever men chose to swear over a thing, the thing itself went on quietly being what it was. It was Hartley who brought her the charter. He brought it folded inside a roll of estate plans, which was, she understood without his having to say so, a small dishonesty on his part. A thing done under the nose of the office that employed him, and would not have wished a copy of so precious a document to go up the Foundry Lane to a spinster's table. He laid it out and weighted the corners with 2 tuning irons and the heel of his hand, and they bent over it together in the short light. It was a beautiful thing, she granted it that. The parchment had the deep cream and beester of true age, foxed and freckled. The ink gone to the brown of old blood. The script was a stiff, spiky, archaic hand, the Latin abbreviated in the manner of the 14th century. The great initial letter flowered out into vine and beast. It granted to the lords of the manor of Quorn, in the year of grace 1347, the sole and several right of pasture, turbary, and enclosure over all that marsh and moor called Witching Fen, saving to the men of the ville only such common as the Lord should from time to time appoint, which was to say, no common at all. And at the foot of it, depending from a plaited cord of faded silk through a slit in the turned-up plica, hung the seal, a fat disk of dark metal the size of a crown piece, struck with the arms of Quorn and a legend run round the rim. And Stourton had lodged it, Hartley said, with great ceremony before the magistrates, as the very seal dies impress, coeval with the grant, irrefragable proof of an ancient and continuing right. It is bell metal, said Honora. She had said it before she had quite finished knowing why she said it. Hartley looked up at her. The seal, she said. It is not wax, it is not lead, which is what they used commonly for such things. Look at the color of it, that brown gold under the dirt, and look there, where the cord has worn against the rim. See how it has taken a polish, where a softer metal would have only dulled. That is bronze. That is bell bronze, or I have never had my hand on a bell in my life. She drew the candle nearer, careless of the wax, and turned the seal upon its cord. They cast it. They did not strike it in wax from an old die at all. They cast the whole disk in metal, which is a strange and a costly way to make a seal, and an unheard of way to make a 14th century one. A man does it for one reason only, because he means it to last and to look grave, and because metal carries an antiquity in the hand that wax does not, and because she stopped, and felt the cold come up through her differently now, not from the floor but from somewhere under her ribs, because if a man has a furnace and a recipe and a forger's nerve, metal is the one thing he can make look old that the eye will not catch out. But the metal itself, she set the seal down very gently, as though it might wake. Tobias, fetch me the ledger, the 15 book. He did not remark upon the Christian name. She had not known she was going to use it. She let it lie where it had fallen between them and turned to the work. She knew her uncle's recipes as she knew the Psalms, better, for she had never much cared for the Psalms. Gideon Vane's bronze was richer in tin than the old founder's metal, a thing he had come to late in life, and was proud of past all reason, near 25 parts of tin to the 100 where the medieval founders had gone to 13 or 14 and no further, because tin was dear, and because too much of it made a metal that rang sweet but grew brittle with the centuries. A true 14th century bell, or a true 14th century seal cast from the sweepings of such a bell, would be poor in tin, gray brittle, almost leaden in the hue of its break. This seal was warm. This seal had the very color, under its coat of contrived grime, of the metal in the cracked St. Botolph bell that lay even now in her own yard, the bell her ear had first quarreled with, the bell her uncle's cipher had marked false. She did not need the assay cup and the file to know it, though she would have them both before she was done. She knew it the way she had known the cooling tenor's note at 11 years old, with her cheek against its loam gray side. The seal that crowned Aurelian Storton's ancient charter was cast of the same too modern, too sweet, too rich bronze as the bells he called 4 centuries old, and the two of them had come, near as made no difference, out of the same crucible, in the same year, under the same hand. But it was the founder's mark that finished it, and the founder's mark was Hartley's doing, for she would never have thought to look, the thing being so small and set in so unlikely a place. He had a sailor's habit of reading every inch of a document as he would read every inch of a coast, taking nothing on trust, and it was he who put his thumbnail to the lower rim of the seal where the legend ran out and said, "There is a maker's device here, beneath the lettering." A little bell with a cross above it and 2 letters in the crook of it. R.M. Honora went very still. "Show me," she said, and looked, and there it was, sunk small and proud into the bronze. A founder's stamp, a bell surmounted by a cross, the initials R.M. set in the bow. "That," she said, "is the mark of Roger Mell. He was a founder out of Barry, a good one. My uncle spoke of him with respect, which was more than he gave most men." She was already turning the ledger's stiff leaves, and her finger came down upon the entry. "Roger Mell," she read, "freed of the founders in 1703. Set up his furnace at Bury St. Edmunds, 1709. Died, and his stock and dyes sold to my uncle's master, 1741. She looked up, and her voice when it came was as steady as she could make it and no steadier. "His mark cannot have stood upon a 14th century seal, Mr. Hartley, because there was no Roger Mell until the 18th. They have signed their forgery with the name of a man who was not born for 350 years after the date they have written at the head of it. It is as though a man should forge a deed of the conquest and seal it with the king's likeness off a guinea." For a moment neither of them spoke. The little furnace stove ticked as it cooled. Out in the yard a wind came off the fen and found the cracked bells and drew from them a low confused moaning that was not a chord and not a tune, the sound the yard made in weather, that she had once thought the saddest sound in the parish and now found she loved. Hartley straightened slowly from the table and looked at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen there before, not surprise, for he had half believed her these many days, but a kind of grimness settling. The look, she thought, of a man who has sighted a thing on the horizon he had hoped not to see, and now must beat toward it, whatever the weather. "Then he means to take the fen," Hartley said quietly, "the whole of Witching Fen, the grazing and the turf and the reed, and ruin every freeholder that has a right of common upon it, and crown himself the antiquary of the county into the bargain, and the whole of it stands upon a charter he had forged, and a peal of bells he had cast and called 400 years old. And the one man in Suffolk who could have proved it false was your uncle, who knew it and catalogued it and held his tongue and died." Held his tongue, Honora said, or was helped to it. She had not let herself say that aloud before either. It sat in the cold air between them and would not go back. She must be sure. That was the thing she came back to, lying awake, walking the cold flags, turning the seal in her fingers until she knew its every freckle. She could be wrong about the bells in her own yard. A yard bell was a fallen thing, its note changed by the crack and the years. She must put her hands on the peal itself, hung and swinging in the tower of St. Botolph's, and read them where they sang. To get into the belfry, she would have to have a reason that no one would think to question. And the reason, when it came, was so plain she was ashamed not to have seen it sooner. She offered through the curate to make a drawing. The poor drawing mistress, the dowerless cousin, harmless and overlooked, wished to make a careful study of the famous restored bells for a portfolio. The curate, a mild young man flattered to have his celebrated tower noticed, saw nothing in it but a spinster's industry, and gave her the key of the ringing chamber and the loft above with his blessing and a caution about the stair. They went up on a still afternoon when the light was failing early, she and Hartley, by the worn newel stair that wound up through the thickness of the wall, past the ringing chamber, up the trap and the ladder into the bell loft where the great frame stood black against the louvers and the 8 bells hung mouth down in their cage of oak, huge and silent and faintly warm, with a warmth that was only the warmth of the day held in the metal, but felt always like something living and asleep. Hartley held the lantern low and shaded, for they were not, after all, quite entitled to be doing what they were doing. And Honora set down her drawing things untouched upon a beam, and went to the bells with her bare hands. She knew within the first minute, with the certainty that was the only dowry her uncle had left her, and the only one she had ever wanted. The tenor first, she laid her palm to the sound bow where the clapper bruised it, and she ran her fingertips slow along the inner rim, and she found the tuning marks. The bright filed flats where the founder had taken metal off to bring the note true, and they were fresh. Not fresh as yesterday, but fresh as a man's lifetime. The file scars clean-edged and unweathered under the green, where 400 winters in a Suffolk tower would have furred and softened and half erased them. She put her ear close, and had Hartley draw the clapper aside and let it fall back the gentlest touch, a sound no louder than a struck wineglass, and the bell gave up its note into the dark of the loft. And the note was sweet and rich and modern, the note of her uncle's tin-proud bronze, the note that had no business living in a bell that men swore had rung for Kersey and the Black Death and the burning of Lollards on the green below. She went from bell to bell along the frame, the lantern moving with her, Hartley silent at her shoulder, and each one told her the same tale in the same voice, and on the waist of the fourth, low down and small and proud, her fingers found the founder's mark sunk in the bronze, a little bell, a cross above, and in the bow of it the letters R.M., and she stood in the cold loft with her hand upon a 300-weight lie and felt no triumph at all, only a great and settling sorrow, because she had hoped, somewhere under all her certainty, to be proved a foolish spinster after all, and to find the bells honest, and to go home. It was as they came down, out of the loft, down the ladder, through the trap into the ringing chamber where the daylight from the lancet window was the color of weak tea, that the thing between them came nearest to a name. The stair below was steep and the lantern poor, and Honora's foot found a worn tread treacherous, and she put out a hand, and Hartley's hand was there, and for the length of a breath they stood close in the narrow cold of the wall stair, with his hand under her arm, and her other hand flat against his chest where she had put it to steady herself, and she felt the slow, strong beat of his heart under the rough cloth and the cold buttons, and neither of them moved, and neither of them spoke. And the lantern made one small, unsteady world of gold around the two of them, with the whole dark church beneath, and the false bells hanging in the dark above. "I have your weight," he said at last, very low, which was a sailor's plain thing to say, and meant only that she would not fall. And yet it was the truest tender word that had been said to her in 19 years, since her uncle had not called her away from the cooling tenor, and she heard everything in it that he had not let himself say, and she let it be enough, because she did not dare yet to let it be more. I know, said Honora. I am not afraid of the stair. And she took her hand from his chest, and they went down into the body of the church and out by the south door into the dusk, and gave the curate back his key, and thanked him and said the bells were very fine. It was the misfortune of the case that the proof of it lived in places no one would let her stand and speak, in the bow of a hung bell 40 feet up a locked tower, in the color of a medal under a coat of dirt, in a dead man's cipher of dots and strokes that to any other eye was the doodling of a failing mind. And the world, meanwhile, did its talking at the assembly rooms in witching Magna, where the county gathered to dance and play at cards and decide, by no vote that was ever taken, what was true. The Pellews carried Honora there still, that autumn, for it would have set tongues going to leave the cousin home. So she sat in her dove gray and her single jet brooch in the draught by the door, fetching Drusilla's shawl, and watched the room make a hero. For Aurelian Staunton was the hero of the season. The discovery of the ancient peel had got into the county paper, and a gentleman from the Society of Antiquaries in London had written him a flattering letter, and the rooms were full of the word, antiquity, antiquity, as though it were a perfume the man had bottled and was handing round. He stood at the warm end of the long room with his back to the fire and the candlelight kind upon him, and the squires' wives leaned in, and the rector beamed. Honora ought to have held her tongue. She knew it even as she did not. But the talk had turned to the fen, to the great improvement Mr. Staunton meant of it, the draining and the diking, and the enclosing, the new straight hedges where now there was only the wet wild common, and a lady asked prettily, was it not a pity for the poor folk who turned their geese out there? And Staunton said, with the gentlest regret in the world, that the law was the law and the charter plain. The right had lain in his family these 5 centuries, and he could no more set it aside than he could set aside the Magna Carta, and the room murmured its sad agreement, and Honora heard herself say, into a small lull, that 1347 was an interesting date to fix upon, for the great pestilence had come into Suffolk in the very next year, and carried off near half the founders and the clerks in it, and it was a wonder any grant of that exact season should come down to us so fresh and so whole. She had meant it mildly. She had meant only to set one small true stone in the path. The room turned and looked at her as at a clock that had spoken. Staunton recovered first, and recovered beautifully. Miss Vane, he said, and smiled, and let the smile travel round the room so that they might all share the indulgence of it, is the niece of our late founder, and has, I do not doubt, picked up a deal of curious learning at her uncle's furnace, a most unusual accomplishment in a lady, and a most touching loyalty to his memory. We must forgive her if grief has made her a little ardent in these matters. It was perfectly done. It conceded her nothing while granting her everything that could not hurt him. It made her a poor mad pious thing nursing an old man's notions, and it made him the soul of charity for bearing with her. And the room loved him the better for it and her not at all, and a girl near the fire actually laughed behind her fan. Honora felt the heat go up her throat into her face and held very still, the way she had learned to hold still at the Pellews, and said nothing more, because there was nothing she could say in that room that would not be the saying of a clock. It was Hartley who spoke. She had not known he was come. He stood near the card-room door in his plain dark coat, out of place among the silks as a tide mark, and his voice when it came was quiet, and carried the whole length of the room the way a quiet voice will when it has been used to carrying across water. I should be slow to call it grief, sir, he said, or learning curious, that can tell the true note of a bell from a false one by the ear alone. I have watched Miss Vane do it. I would back her reading of a piece of metal against any antiquary's reading of a piece of parchment, for the parchment can be made to say what a man pleases, and the metal cannot. It fell into the room like a stone into a still pond. Staunton's eyes came round to him, and for the briefest instant Honora saw it. Who was watching for it, the charm was simply not there, and something flat and cold looked out before the smile came down again like a sash window. "Mr. Hartley defends the ladies," he said lightly. "It is very gallant. One forgets he is not quite of the county." And he turned the talk, smooth as butter, to the dancing, but the thing had been said, and a few heads had turned to Honora with a new and uneasy curiosity, and she knew that Aurelian Staunton would not forget that a land agent and a charity spinster had, between them, in his own season of triumph, made the room remember for half a minute that a question existed. She knew, too, now what the question cost the parish, for Hartley had made her know it. He would not let her think of it as a matter of charters and dates only. He had taken her one raw morning out along the drove road to the edge of Witching Fen and named the people on it. There was Griselle Lound, the widow, who kept her 3 geese and a goat upon the common and her dead husband's right of turbary, and who could no more pay a rent for grazing than she could pay for the moon. There was Eli Murrow, the lame shepherd, who had the run of the fen for a little flock that was the whole of what stood between his family and the parish rolls, and who had limped over to touch his hat to Hartley and ask, with a dreadful mildness, whether it were true that the gentleman meant to hedge it all. There were a dozen more, freeholders in name with rights older than any charter and poorer than any of them could prove on paper, and the autumn quarter sessions, 6 weeks off now, would with one stroke of the magistrates' pens turn the wet wild common where they had grazed and cut and snared time out of mind into the enclosed property of Aurelian Staunton, and turn Griselle Lound and Eli Murrow and the rest out upon a charity that had no room for them. Honora had stood on the drove road with the wind off the fen flattening the rushes in long gray waves and the geese going over, and she had understood that the bells were not the matter at all. The bells were only the lie. The fen was the matter, and the people on it, and she had thought, with a steadiness that surprised her, that she would burn the foundry to the ground and herself in it before she would let that lie ring out unanswered. Staunton came to her himself, in the end. He came up the foundry lane on a fine bay horse, alone, on a still afternoon, when Hartley was away at the surveyor's office, and that he had chosen that afternoon she did not for a moment suppose to be chance. He did not dismount at first, but sat looking down the yard at the rows of cracked bells on their beds of oak, and at her in her foundry apron with her sleeves turned up and a smear of loam upon her wrist, and there was a kind of wonder in his face, real enough, that a woman of his own blood-adjacent class should stand so among the dirt and the dead metal. Then he got down, graceful, and gave her good day, and praised the picturesque melancholy of the place, and came at last, by the smoothest of roads, to his errand. He had been thinking, he said, of her situation. Forgive him. But the whole county knew it. A lady of family left to keep up a ruin in a yard of broken bells, and the cold coming on, and no soul to help her. It pained him. He would not see a vein so used. He was prepared to buy the freehold of Hollow Cross at a price that would, he ventured to say, astonish her with its generosity, and he would take 2 off her hands, the old iron chest and its papers, which could be nothing to her but a melancholy weight of her uncle's failing years, and were of a small antiquarian interest to himself merely, a fellow feeling for the trade. She might be free of all of it by Christmas, comfortably settled, spared a labor no gentlewoman should be put to. He named the sum. It was a great deal of money. It was, she understood quite clearly, the price of her silence in the chests, and the price of Grizzlelound's geese and Eli Murrow's flock all in the one figure, offered with a bow. "You are very good, sir," said Honora, and wiped the loam from her wrist with great care, and did not take her eyes from his. "But I find I have grown fond of the labor, and the chest my uncle left to me by name. You know, as the one inheritance I should know how to read. I should be a poor niece to part with it before I had finished the reading." For one heartbeat more the pleasant mask held, and then, just at the eyes, it thinned, and the cold, flat thing she had seen for an instant in the assembly rooms looked out at her again, longer now, and unhurried, taking her measure as a man takes the measure of an obstacle he had thought to walk through, and finds he must instead go round or break. "Finish the reading, then, Miss Vane, by all means," he said, and the voice was still silk, but there was something under the silk now like a file laid against metal. "Only have a care. An old foundry is a perilous place for a woman alone. Such dry old timber, such heavy bells, so ill secured upon their beds, so many ways for a careless person to come to harm among them, and no one within call." He smiled and gathered his reins and rode unhurried back up the lane, leaving the threat hanging in the still air behind him like smoke that would not lift. The decline of Honora Vane's standing did not come as a blow, but as a slow lowering of the light, the way an autumn afternoon withdraws from a room without anyone marking the moment the warmth has gone. It began with small things. The vicar's wife, who had once paused at the foundry gate to ask, kindly enough, whether Honora found the solitude trying, now passed on the far side of the lane with her bonnet turned a degree too far, as though the wind had taken her attention. The drawing-master's pupils she had been promised, two merchants' daughters whose fathers had spoken of engaging her for the winter, a small income that might have kept her independent of the Pellews' charity, were withdrawn in a single week, with letters that regretted, in identical phrasing, that arrangements had altered. Honora read the two letters side by side at the foundry's long deal table and understood that they had been composed under the same roof, or at least by the same prompting hand, and she felt the cold of it settle in her chest like the cold of the casting pit itself. She knew where the prompting came from. She did not need to be told, though she was told soon enough, by a kindness crueler than malice. Old Mrs. Crisp, the bell-hanger's widowed sister, came down to the foundry with a basket of windfall pears, and over the pears she let fall, with much sighing and many sidelong looks, the things that were being said of Honora in the better parlors of Witching Magna, that Master Vane had died queer in his wits, and left his foundry to the only relation queer enough to want it, that the spinster niece had taken to living rough among cracked metal and old papers, talking to the bells as her uncle had done, and that grief had unhinged what little the years had left her, that she went about claiming, in her unwomanly way, that gentlemen of family and learning had got their dates wrong. She, who had no learning but what she had stolen by listening at a foundry door. Mr. Stourton, it was said with admiration, bore the poor creature's slanders against his great antiquarian discovery with perfect Christian patience, and had even offered, out of charity to her late uncle's memory, to take the burdensome property off her hands and see her settled somewhere quiet and suitable. Was it not handsome of him? Was it not exactly what one would expect of so rising a young man? Honora thanked Mrs. Crisp for the pears and saw her to the gate and did not weep until the woman was well out of sight, and then she wept only briefly, standing among the rejected bells with her hand flat on the bronze flank of the great cracked tenor, feeling under her palm the long fault that ran from soundbow to crown like a vein of darkness. She understood the campaign with perfect clarity. Stourton would not need to prove her wrong. he had only to make her unhearable. A truth, however exact, that issued from the mouth of an unhinged spinster living among scrap was no truth at all in the country that mattered, and he had grasped before she had that the surest defense against her ear was to persuade 3 parishes that the ear was mad. It was cheaper than buying her silence and surer than threatening it, and it left his own hands white. She admired the economy of it even as it closed around her throat. Hartley found her so that evening, dry-eyed again and bent over the ledger by a single rush light, and he did not ask whether she had heard the talk, for he had heard it himself in 4 places that day, and had answered it in all 4, with a flat plainness that, she would learn, had begun to cost him too. He set down on the table a folded sheet that proved to be a copy he had made, in his neat sailor's hand, of the enclosure award as it would be lodged at the autumn quarter sessions, the document that, once sealed by the commissioners, would extinguish forever the freeholder's ancient right to graze and turf and gather upon Witching Fen, on the strength of the charter whose seal was struck from bronze that had not existed when the charter claimed to have been written. He had brought it because she had asked to see the precise wording, and because, she understood, he wished her to know that he had not abandoned the labor merely because the county had begun to abandon her. They worked an hour by the rushlight, her finger and his moving down the columns of the ledger and the lines of the award, and for that hour the cold went out of the foundry, and she was not a charity nor a madwoman, but only what her uncle had made her, a reader of bells, with a man beside her who asked her questions as though her answers would settle them. It was a little before midnight, after Hartley had gone, that she heard the first wrong sound. She had not undressed. She had taken to sleeping but lightly, in her gown, on the cot she had made up in the small counting room off the casting floor, with the iron chest of the ledgers pulled close beside her, where she could lay a hand on its cold lid in the dark. So she heard through the broken window pane she had stuffed with sacking the small, definite noises that have no business in a sleeping yard, the scrape of a gate hinge she had oiled herself and knew the voice of, then a stillness too careful to be the wind, then the dull complaint of metal dragged over stone. She was up and at the counting-room door, with the rush light unlit in her hand before she had finished waking, and she stood in the dark with her heart going hard and looked out across the moon-gray yard. And she saw them. 2 men, perhaps 3, the moon was down, and they were only thicknesses in the dark, moving with the heavy purpose of men handling a weight. They had got ropes about the great cracked St. Botolph bell, the very bell whose too pure note and too modern alloy had first told her ear that the celebrated ancient peal was a lie. The bell her uncle's cipher had marked false, the single article of physical proof that a man with no learning could be made to strike and hear and believe, and they were hauling it, with grunting effort, over the cobbles toward the black water of the Foundry pond. She understood in one breath what was happening, and in the next that she could not stop it. She was one woman. They were 3 men who had come prepared to be unseen. To run out into the yard would be to put herself among them in the dark, and she had wit enough, even in that moment of fury, to know what 3 men who had come by night to destroy evidence might do to the one witness who could name it. She pressed herself into the doorframe and watched, shaking, while they dragged the proof of everything across her uncle's yard. The bell went into the pond with a sound she would hear for the rest of her life, not a ring, for a cracked bell does not ring, but a single muffled gout of a note half strangled in the splash, the drowned ghost of the voice it should have had, and then the slap and suck of the water closing over it. And while 2 of the men were still at the pond's edge, paying out the slackened rope, the 3rd did the thing she had truly to fear. He went to the muniment shed. the low stone outbuilding where the bulk of her uncle's casting papers were stored, the racked records of 60 years, the very archive on which her whole case beyond the single bell depended. And she saw the small, ugly flare of a lantern slide opened, and then the larger, softer bloom of flame taking hold in dry old paper and dry old wood. She did not decide to move. She was simply moving. The fear that had held her at the door against 3 men in the dark could not hold her against fire, for fire took no notice of whether she stood and watched or ran, and the chest beside her cot held only a part of the ledgers, the working part, the part she carried back and forth. But the shed held the rest, the deep bedrock of dates and alloys that turned one woman's hearing into a 60-year record no gentleman could wave away. She was across the casting floor and out the side door with her uncle's casting shovel snatched up in both hands before she had thought. And she was shouting Hartley's name, though Hartley was a mile gone and could not hear, shouting fire and thieves into the indifferent night. And the noise of her, a single furious voice tearing open the silence they had counted on, did what her body alone could not. The men did not stay to be named. There was a scramble at the pond's edge, a rope flung down, the gate hinge crying out again, and they were gone into the dark of the lane, leaving her alone with the burning shed. She would not afterward be able to give a clear account of the next hour, only fragments, hot and disordered. The casting shovel was no use against fire. She took up instead the long-handled wooden bucket from the slacking trough and ran it again and again to the pond, the same pond that had just swallowed her proof, hauling up black water and throwing it at the doorway of the shed. And it was not enough. A thimble against a furnace, and she knew it was not enough and could not stop. The heat drove her back. The papers nearest the door were already gone, curling and lifting in bright flakes that rose into the dark like a foul snow falling upward, and she stood in the orange light with the empty bucket and understood that she was watching her uncle's life burn and could do nothing but witness it. It was the light that saved what could be saved. Hartley, riding home along the upper road, saw the glow against the night where no honest light should be, and came down the lane at a gallop, and was off the horse and over the gate before it had fully stopped, and he did not waste a breath asking what or how. He took one look at the shed well alight, at Honora soot black and wild and weeping with rage rather than grief, at the bucket, and he took command in the plain hard way of a man who had fought fires at sea, where there is nowhere to run from them. The shed was lost, he saw it in a glance and did not try for it. What he tried for, what he shouted at her to help him try for, was everything not yet alight. The counting room, the casting floor, and above all the iron chest. They could not save the shed. They could keep the fire from crossing to the main building, and they did, the two of them, with the slacking trough and the pond and the long iron rakes from the casting floor, beating out the bright debris that came drifting down onto the thatch of the lean-to, soaking the timbers that stood nearest the heat, working in a black and gasping silence broken only by his short orders and her answers, until the worst of it had eaten what it could reach and begun, sullenly, to fail for want of fresh fuel. When it was over, when the shed was a low red ruin settling on itself and the danger to the rest had passed, they sat down where they stood, on the cold cobbles in the reek of wet ash, too spent to speak. Honora's hands were burned across the palms where she had beaten out a falling brand without feeling it. Her gown was ruined. Her face was a black mask streaked pale where the smoke had wept from her eyes. Hartley sat beside her with his coat gone and his shirt scorched and his own hands raw, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all, only breathed, and watched the ruin breathe its last heat into the dark. The iron chest stood safe in the counting room behind them. The working ledgers were saved. But the bell, the one mute object that could have made an unlearned man hear the lie, lay in the black mud at the bottom of the pond, and the deep archive that might have stood in the bell's place was a heap of glowing nothing. And they both knew, sitting there, that the case as they had built it had been gutted in a single hour. Her ear and her uncle's private cipher remained, but her ear was, in the mouths of the county, the ear of a madwoman, and a cipher of dots and strokes that only she could read was, against a gentleman's word and a great parchment charter, precisely nothing at all. A spinster's fancy. They had not needed to disprove her. They had only needed to take away the thing she could put into another man's hand. "He will say it was an accident," Hartley said at last, his voice cracked with smoke. "A vagrant, a spark from your own hearth. He will be sorrowful about it in company. He will say it is a great pity, and that it shows why such a property is no place for a lady alone, and that his offer stands." He turned his blackened face to her in the dying light. "He is not wrong that you cannot stay here alone. After tonight he is not wrong about that one thing. I have nowhere else," Honora said. She had spoken without self-pity as a plain fact, but she heard the fact land between them and felt its full weight only as she said it, and she knew before the next day proved it that the Pellews would not have her back. She was right. The summons came, not from Drusilla, but from Septimus, in a stiff, brief note that arrived with the morning and did not trouble to be kind. Mr. Pellew, the note said, had given the matter his most careful thought. He could no longer countenance his household being associated, however distantly, with the scandal and disorder that had attached itself to his wife's cousin, the nocturnal violence, the wild accusations against persons of the first respectability, the whole sorry spectacle of a woman who would not be advised. He had his daughters to think of, and his connections, and his name. He regretted that he could no longer extend to Miss Vane the protection of his roof or the use of his name, and he trusted that she would find, in the property her uncle had so unwisely left her, occupation enough to keep her from troubling her relations further. There was a postscript in Drusilla's hand, sharper still, expressing the hope that Honora was satisfied now with the ruin she had brought upon herself by her ingratitude and her pride. Honora read it standing among the cracked bells with her bandaged hands, and found she could not even summon anger at it, only a tired and final clarity. The note was not the cause of her ruin, but the proof of it. The moment at which the slow lowering of the light reached the floor, and the room went dark. Septimus Pellew was a cloth merchant, and his cloth went to market on the goodwill of the county gentry. And Aurelian Storton was the rising man of that gentry, and the note in her hands was simply the sound a frightened tradesman makes when a powerful young gentleman lets it be known, smilingly, over wine, that he wonders the Pellews continue to harbor so unfortunate a connection. She had stopped, in one stroke, being a charity it cost the Pellews nothing to keep, and become a liability it might cost Septimus a contract to be seen with. So they cut her loose, as a ship in a storm cuts a fouled boat loose, and they told themselves it was virtue. She folded the note and put it away in the chest with the ledgers, where a record of the thing belonged, and she went on living in the cold foundry because there was now nowhere on the earth that she had any right to be but here, among her uncle's rejected bells, in the one inheritance she knew how to read. The cost to Hartley came 2 days after. It came in a manner she did not learn of until it was already paid, which was like him, and which made it harder to bear. Storton's lawyers, for Storton, lodging the enclosure, employed the same witching attorneys who had once acted for Lady Corn's estate, required, as the final formality before the award went to the commissioners, that the survey of Witching Fen be certified accurate and complete by the estate's own land agent, whose office it was to know the ground. That land agent was Tobias Hartley. His name, his seal, his sailor's word for the soundness of the survey was the last small joint that the great machine of the enclosure needed in order to close, and Hartley asked plainly to certify a survey that he knew to be the instrument of a fraud and a robbery, set down his pen and refused. He told her of it without drama, sitting at her deal table the same evening, having ridden over as he did each day, and she did not at first understand the magnitude of what he was telling her until she saw his face. He had refused to certify. He had told the attorneys, in writing, that he could not in conscience set his hand to a survey advanced upon a charter he had reason to believe forged, and that he would say as much before the commissioners or any court if he were asked. And the attorneys, acting on instructions she did not need named, had that afternoon dismissed him from the agency of the Corn estate that had been his whole livelihood and his whole standing since the Navy had cast him out, had dismissed him, and would see to it, as Staunton had seen to her, that no other gentleman in the county engaged a land agent who had proved himself unreliable, unbiddable, a maker of trouble against his betters. He had done for her, with his open eyes, exactly what the world had just finished doing to her. He had made himself unhearable. He had spent the one thing he had rebuilt out of the wreck of his first life. His place, his employment, the slow-earned respect of the country that had once court-martialed and discarded him, and he had spent it on her foundry and her bells and her uncle's dead truth, knowing precisely what it would cost and choosing to pay. She sat across the table from him in the rushlight and could not speak. She had been cast out by people who had merely ceased to find her useful, and that she could bear, for it asked nothing of her heart. This was a different order of thing entirely. This was a man who had nothing to gain and everything left to lose, laying down the everything for her, and looking at her now across the scarred deal with his scorched hands quiet on the wood and something in his steady face that she had been refusing for weeks to let herself read, and that she could refuse no longer. "You should not have done it," she said, and her voice was not her own. "Tobias, you should not have done it for me. I did not do it for you," he said, and then, with the plain truthfulness that was the bone of him, he amended it, because he would not even now tell her a comfortable lie. "That is not true. I did it for the freeholders, and for the thing being right, and for your uncle who I never met and have come to honor. But I did it for you also. I will not pretend otherwise. I have been pretending otherwise to myself for some weeks, and I find, now that I have lost everything that made me a man worth your hearing, that I have no more use for the pretense." He looked at his ruined hands and then at her ruined ones. The two of them burned in the same fire, and she watched him gather the courage of it the way she had once watched her uncle gather a true note out of a flawed casting. "I have no place now, and no income, and no name worth the offering. I am, this evening, every bit as poor and as cast off as they say you are. I have nothing on the earth to lay before you but myself, and that grown shabby. It is the worst moment a man ever chose to speak in. But I find I cannot sit at your table another night and not say that I love you, and that whatever is left to me, little as it is yours if you will have it, and that I will stand at your side before the sessions and before the whole county, whether you will have it or not, because I would rather be ruined beside you in the right than prosperous anywhere in the wrong." And Enora, who had taught herself across 9 gray years to want nothing, to expect nothing, who had learned that to believe in good fortune was to bare your throat to its withdrawal, felt the whole of that hard-won safety crack across like the flank of the tenor bell under her hand, and felt terror flood in where the crack opened. Not terror of him, terror of believing him, terror of being, to a man who had just beggared himself, one more weight he had taken up in a moment of high feeling and would come, in some cold future, to resent. Terror of letting herself be loved and finding it, like every other warmth she had ever reached toward, a thing that could be withdrawn and leave her colder than before. She opened her mouth to refuse him, to do it gently, to give him back his freedom and his sacrifice, and tell him he must keep what little he had left and not spend it on a drowned cause and a drowned woman. And she got as far as his name, and could go no further, and sat with the refusal dying unsaid in her throat while he waited, not pressing her, only waiting, with the patience of a man who had learned at sea that some things will not be hurried and must simply be endured until they turn. It was the chest that broke the silence. She had been clearing it that afternoon, going through to the very bottom the working ledgers she had saved from the fire, putting her hands on each surviving thing as if to count what was left to her. And at the bottom, where the iron floor of it should have been, her burned fingers had found the floor sitting a half-inch high and a thought too light. She had not had the heart, with the ash still warm in the yard, to learn what it meant. Now, with Hartley's declaration hanging unanswered in the air, and her own refusal stuck fast in her throat, she rose without a word, because she could not bear to either accept or refuse, and the chest was the only third thing in the room, and she knelt to it and pressed where the iron was wrong, and the false bottom her uncle had fitted into his own ledger chest. Fitted, she would understand, by a man who had known he had dangerous knowledge and had not trusted it all to a single floor, lifted on its hidden lip, and showed her what he had hidden under the record of his life, against the very day she now stood in. The deposition lay between them on the molding bench like a thing that might take fright and fly, and for a long while neither Honora nor Hartley dared touch it again, as though the very air of the foundry, thick with cold loam and the iron smell of old casting, might wear the ink from the page. It was past midnight. The single rushlight threw their shadows huge against the rack of tuning irons, and outside the broken yard the autumn wind moved across witching fen with the long, grieving sound that fen wind makes, the sound of a place that does not know yet whether it will be saved. Honora had read the words 4 times, her uncle's hand, crabbed and certain, sworn before the old vicar Mr. Endicott, and witnessed beneath, that the peal of St. Botolph's and the wax and metal seal appended to the corn charter were recast forgeries, founded within his own working memory, and that he had been paid in silence by the late Mr. Storton, Aurelian's father, to let the lie stand and ring. She had thought, when she found it folded in the false bottom with the twin tuning template wrapped in oiled silk beside it, that she would weep. She had not wept. She had felt instead a steadiness come into her, like the moment before a bell is struck true, the long and drawn quiet of a thing about to sound. "It is not enough," she said at last, and Hartley, who had learned in these weeks not to soften her with comfort she had not asked for, only looked at her and waited. "A paper," she went on, turning the jet brooch at her throat with one ungloved finger, a habit he had come to watch for. "A dead man's paper, and the dead man my uncle, and I his disinherited niece, who lives now in his cold foundry because no roof in the parish will have me." Staunton will stand up in his good coat and say it is the forgery of a bitter spinster who learned her uncle's hand at his knee. And half the bench will believe him, because believing him costs them nothing, and believing me costs them the comfort of thinking a woman cannot read what they cannot. Hartley set his palm flat on the bench, not near enough to touch her, near enough that she felt the warmth of it. Then we do not ask them to believe a paper, he said. We make them hear. And that was the whole of the next 11 days. Those 4 words turned into labor. They had until the autumn quarter sessions at Witching Magna, and the sessions had been brought forward. Honora was certain Staunton had a hand in that, for a man who senses the ground softening under his feet will run the faster toward solid stone. 11 days to build a case that no bench could wave away with a gentleman's word, and to build it without money, without standing, with the 2 of them cast out, and the proof bell that had been their clearest object lying smashed at the bottom of the Foundry pond, so they did not rely on the bell that was lost. They went first to fetch the men who could not be unsaid. Jotham Crisp lived 3 miles off in a turf and timber cottage at the fen's edge, a bell hanger past 70 with hands like the roots of a thorn tree, and he had hung the St. Botolph peal himself as a young man of 20-odd, sweating up the tower with the new cast bells while the old vicar's predecessor swore them ancient to the parish. Honora had thought he might be afraid. Old men with little left are often the most afraid of losing the little. But when she sat in his low doorway and told him plainly what the bells were, and what Staunton meant to do with them, and named the widow Grizzle Lound and the lame shepherd Eli Murrow, whose grazing would go under the enclosure fence, the old man's face did a slow and terrible thing. I hung 'em, he said. God forgive me, I were paid, and I hung 'em, and I held my tongue 40 year because Master Gideon held his, and I thought, if he can swallow it, who am I? But Master Gideon swallowed not. He looked at the deposition in her hands, and his eyes filled, not with fear now. He writ it down. All them years he writ it down so it not die with him. I'll swear. Stand me afore the justices, and I'll swear the year and the day and the weight of every bell I carried up that tower. Hartley wrote down his words there in the doorway, and Crisp made his mark, and it was a beginning that had a man's living breath in it. The antiquary was harder, and it was the antiquary that taught Honora how the thing must be done. Dr. Ambrose Wren of Barry was a fussy, learned, vain little man who had published a folio on the church bells of 3 counties and considered himself the final word on any matter of founding before 1500. And when Hartley first wrote to him, he replied with a letter so dripping in condescension that Honora laughed aloud reading it, that he would of course be delighted to correct the misapprehensions of an enthusiastic lady. The bells of St. Botolph's being, beyond all serious doubt, of the 14th century, as any properly trained eye could see from the lettering of their inscriptions alone. She did not write back to argue. She wrote back to invite him to the Foundry, and she laid out for him, when he came, not opinions, but the ledger. She let the man bluster the length of the yard, naming this cracked bell and that, until she stood him before the rejected St. Botolph bell's smaller sister. For there were 2 of that false peal in Gideon's yard, and Staunton's men in their hurry had only hauled out and drowned the one, and she said, very mildly, "You will tell me this is 14th century work, Dr. Wren." By the lettering. He said he would. Then tell me, she said, why it is founded in a bronze a quarter again richer in tin than any founder used before the last century, which my uncle called his own bronze, and which you may assay yourself if you doubt me. And tell me why the founder's mark stamped at the soundbow is the mark of Hosea Vane, my uncle's own master, who was not born until 30 years after the date your lettering claims. The old founders could not stamp a mark for a man unborn, Dr. Wren, not even the cleverest of them. and she put the tuning iron in his hand and showed him, mark by filed mark on the sound bow, how the bell had been tuned by a method no medieval founder had owned, the very method set out in plain ink in her uncle's ledger with the date beside it. She watched the vanity go out of the little man like water out of a cracked crock. He bent over the sound bow a long time. When he straightened, his voice had wholly changed. She had not flattered him into an ally, she had outread him into one. And that, she would think later, was the only kind of ally worth the having. "Madam," Dr. Wren said, and there was nothing condescending left in it, "I have been 40 years a fool with a folio. You have undone me in an afternoon, and I am glad of it. Tell me where you mean to fight, and I will tell the bench what the medal says, and let any man who has essayed less than I contradict me." There remained Lady Quorn, and Lady Quorn was Hartley's to win, for it was Lady Quorn who truly held the Quorn-Stourton estate, and on whose ancient family name Aurelian had hung his whole forged antiquity. She was 80 if she was a day, half-blind, sharp as a flensing knife, and she had not stirred from her dower house at Quarndon in 2 years. Hartley went to her alone, in his one good coat, having been her grandson's land agent until he refused to certify the false survey and was turned off for it, and Honora did not go because she understood, by now, the shapes of the world she lived in, that the old woman would hear a dismissed lieutenant of her own household before she would hear a spinster of no name at all, and that pride must sometimes be set down in the yard like a heavy bell to get the gate open. She waited at the foundry through the whole short autumn day for him to come back, and could not work, and tuned the same cracked bell over and over until its note was the only steady thing in her. He came at dusk. She knew before he spoke that it had gone hard, and then turned, because his face wore the look it had worn the day he refused the survey and lost his living, a kind of grim, washed peace. "She did not believe me at the first," he said, sitting heavily on the bench, or rather she did, and despised me for bringing it. "She said I was a sea officer turned tale-bearer, and that her family's bells had rung true since the Plantagenets, and would I take a glass of Madeira and get out? And then I read her the deposition. Your uncle's words. And when I came to the part where he names the late Mr. Stourton, her own son-in-law, Aurelian's father, paying him to keep the lie, she stopped me." He rubbed his face. "She made me read that part 3 times. Then she sat in the dark a long while. And she said," he looked up at Honora, she said, "So the boy means to enclose my fen and beggar my own tenants to be thought grander than his grandmother. On a lie his father bought. He always did want to be ancient." And she rang for her woman and her traveling chair, Honora. "She is coming to the sessions. She means to be in that hall." Honora found she had to sit down. Lady Quorn at the sessions, the estate's true holder, 80 years old and unimpeachable, rising in person to disown the very antiquity her grandson had forged in her name, was a weight on their side of the scale that no bench could pretend to weigh. But it was still, she knew, weight, and Stourton dealt in weight too. He had the gentry's good opinion, the magistrate's habit of agreeing with men like themselves, and the law's deep patience with a lie that has been allowed to ring for 40 years. They had paper, and they had men. What they did not yet have was the thing that would let the meanest, deafest, most stubborn ear in the moot hall judge the matter for itself without the mediation of a single expert it was disposed to distrust. And so, on the 8th day, with the smashed proof bell at the bottom of the pond and the surviving sister too fragile and too much hers to risk, Honora decided that they would cast a bell. It was Crisp who made it possible, and Crisp who wept again when she proposed it, for the old hanger had never thought to see Hollow Cross in blast again, and the doing of it was the nearest thing to a resurrection the place had known since Gideon died in it. They could not found a great bell. There was neither time nor metal nor the strength in 3 pairs of hands for a tenor, but they did not need a great bell. They needed a small, true witness. Honora went to the ledger and to the twin-tuning template from the false bottom, the template her uncle had cut for the very recast peal he was paid to bless, and from it she had the exact note, to the filed mark, that a St. Botolph bell rang. Then she mixed her uncle's bronze to his own written recipe, the rich tin-heavy alloy that no 14th century founder ever owned, and she and Crisp built the small mold on the loam floor by lantern light, and they fired the cupola that had been cold a year, and the foundry that the world had left for dead breathed out heat and light into the autumn dark. Hartley worked the bellows till his good coat was ruined, and he laughed at the ruin of it. When the metal ran, that long, slow tongue of fire pouring into the dark mouth of the mold, Honora stood with her hand at her throat and watched the thing her childhood had been made of happen again, under her own mastery, in her own foundry, by her own recipe, and she understood that whatever the bench did to her in 3 days' time, this could not be taken back. She had founded a bell, and it was hers, and it was true. They struck the cope 2 days later when the casting had cooled, and the small bell came out rough and gray and beautiful, and Honora took the tuning iron her uncle had held and filed the sound bow mark by mark to the template, her ear bent to it, until she struck it and struck the surviving St. Botolph sister beside it, and the 2 bells, one sworn to be 500 years old. One cast that very week rang out across the foundry yard in the identical note, the same modern voice, like twins calling to one another across the lie of the centuries. Crisp made a sound like a man at prayer. Hartley said nothing at all, only looked at her, and what was in his face she would carry to the moot hall and beyond it, for there was, threaded through all this labor, the other thing, the thing neither of them had let themselves name since the night he had been cast off Storton's payroll and had told her, in the burnt smell of the muniment shed, that he loved her, and she, terrified of being one more burden upon a man who had already lost his living for her sake, terrified above all of letting herself believe in a piece of good fortune after a life that had taught her good fortune was for other people, had not been able to answer him. The answer had been waiting all these days like the deposition on the bench, unread, and on the 9th night a letter came for Hartley that brought it to a point. It was from the Admiralty, by way of an old captain who had never forgotten him. A ship, a real ship, a commander's posting to the West India Station, his name cleared enough at last for the sea to want him back. The career that the unjust court-martial had drowned offered up to him whole. He read it by the rushlight, and then he set it down on the molding bench, beside the deposition, beside the small true bell, and he was quiet a long time, and Honora made herself say it, because she would not be the weight that sank him. "You must take it," she said. "Tobias, you have wanted the sea your whole life, and they have given it back to you, and I will not. I cannot be the thing that Honora, you have lost enough for me." Honora, he took her ungloved hand, the one that filed the sound bows, the one no man had thought worth the taking, and he held it as though it were the instrument it was. "I have been at sea 20 years, and it never once asked my opinion of anything. You asked me to teach you to read a bell on the 2nd day we met, and then you taught me, and you have never once in all this looked at me as though I were an ornament or a rescue or anything but a man who might be useful and might be loved. The sea cannot give me that. There is no posting in the world I would take over standing in that hall the day after tomorrow and watching you be believed. I am staying. Whatever the bench does, I am staying. And if you will have me when this is done, I will found bells with you the rest of my life, and never go further out to sea than the witching mill pond. And Honora, who had not wept over the deposition, wept now only a little, and angrily wiping at it, and said that they would settle nothing, until the fen was safe, because she would not be married out of pity, nor out of victory, but out of plain wanting. And there was no room in her for plain wanting until she knew the village was saved. He said that was the most romantic refusal he had ever heard, and that he would hold her to all of it. And they let the matter stand there, sealed and waiting like everything else, to be opened only by the sessions. The last 2 days were a tightening. Staunton had got wind of something. There is no keeping a fired cupola secret in a small parish, and a man does not summon Dr. Ambrose Wren from Barry without the county knowing of it by Sunday. And he moved like a man who feels the rope and means to outrun it. He had the sessions confirmed for the earliest possible morning. He let it be known among the gentry that the disinherited Miss Vane, in her grief and her spinster's spite, had forged a deposition in a dead man's name, and that the law would deal sternly with such a wickedness. He turned the very weapon they meant to use into one pointed back at Honora's own breast, so that she must now prove not only that the bells were false, but that she herself was not the forger. He sent, on the last evening, his attorney to the Foundry with a final velvet offer and a final cold threat folded inside it. A sum of money, generous, to buy the Foundry in the chest and Honora's silence, and beneath it, smooth as the wax of his false seal, the observation that proceedings for forgery were a grave matter for a lady with no protector and no roof, and that a wise woman in her position would think very hard before she carried a fabricated paper into a court of law. Honora read the offer standing in the doorway of the Foundry her uncle had given her, because it was the only inheritance she would know how to read, and she handed it back to the attorney unsigned, and she said only, "Tell Mr. Staunton I will see him at the sessions," and shut the door. That night she did not sleep. She sat among the cooled bells with the deposition and Crisp's sworn mark, and Dr. Wren's letter of recantation, and the small true witness bell wrapped close in clean sacking, and she went over each piece the way her uncle had taught her to go over a casting before it was struck, listening for the flaw, the hidden crack, the place where the metal had not run true. She could find none, and that frightened her more than a flaw would have, for she had lived too long on the underside of fortune to trust a thing that had no fault in it. Toward dawn Hartley came and sat with her, and did not speak, and his being there was the only argument against her fear that held. When the gray light came up over Witching Fen, the fen that would be common land or fenced ruin by the day's end, she rose and washed and put on the dove-gray half-mourning gown that the Pellews had thought a charity and the county had thought a spinster's drabness, and pinned at her throat the single jet brooch that was the only jewel her uncle's sister had left her, and she took up the sacking-wrapped bell in her 2 ungloved hands. Hartley shouldered the iron chest. Crisp was waiting at the lane end in his Sunday coat, and Dr. Wren's chaise was to meet them at the cross, and somewhere on the Corndon Road an 80-year-old woman was being carried in a traveling chair toward a moot hall to disown her own grandson. Every piece was staged. The deposition and Crisp's oath and Wren's testimony and Lady Corn's terrible presence, and the witness bell that rang the truth in a voice any ear could judge, all of it gathered now into the 2 of them walking down the lane in the cold gold light of the sessions morning, toward the town where she would be believed or destroyed. And Honora Vane, who had spent 27 years being told what she could not read, walked toward the moot hall of Witching Magna with the proof of everything in her arms and her chin level, and did not once look back at the Foundry, because she meant, before the sun went down, to have earned the right to return to it as its mistress The witching moot hall had not been so full in the memory of any living soul, and Honora Vane, standing just within its great oak doors in her dove-gray gown, with the single jet brooch at her throat, felt the heat of the crowd come at her like the breath of an open furnace. They had come for the spectacle of it. The gentry in their carriage cloaks ranged along the paneled benches. The farmers and weavers and fen freeholders packed shoulder to shoulder in the standing room at the back. The three magistrates upon the dais beneath the old plastered arms of the borough. Sir Marmaduke Quesnel sat in the center chair, gout-footed and impatient, flanked by the Reverend Dr. Pidle and the lean attorney magistrate Mr. Fenwick, who had a reputation for being fond of brevity and fonder still of any gentleman who could provide it. The autumn light came gray and clean through the tall windows, and it lay across the long table where Mr. Aurelian Stourton had arranged his evidence, as a man arranges a meal he means to serve to guests certain to praise it. He was magnificent, and he knew it. He had dressed for antiquity, in dark sober blue, and he had brought the great charter rolled upon its staff and laid it open with 2 silver weights, so that the parchment lay flat and brown and venerable to every eye, and beside it, upon a square of green baize, the seal, a disk of bell metal the color of old honey, struck with a tower and 3 bells, and a Latin legend, and threaded to the charter on a faded cord. And beside that, upon trestles brought up from St. Botolph's by his own men, 2 of the famous Peel bells themselves, the treble and the second, their bronze gone soft brown with the look of 500 years, their cannons worn, their inscriptions in the cramped black letter that any antiquary in the room would have sworn was Plantagenet work. He had staged it as a relic and a reliquary both, and when he rose to speak the hall went still for him as it had not gone still for any other man that morning. "Worshipful sirs," he said, and his voice was warm and unhurried and pitched to carry, "I shall not weary you. The matter is plain, and plain things are best plainly told. The manor of Quorn Stourton holds, and has held since the 4th year of King Edward III, a several right of pasture and improvement over the waste called Witching Fen, a right granted under this charter, witnessed by this seal, attested by these bells, which were founded and hung in the self-same year that the ink was laid upon this skin. The fen has lain common by sufferance and by sloth. The law allows me to resume what is mine, to drain and enclose it for the improvement of husbandry and the increase of the parish's wealth. I ask only that this court confirm what 5 centuries have already established, that the thing is ancient, and that the ancient thing is mine." He turned, with a small gracious inclination toward the standing freeholders at the back. "I am told there are those who fear for their few geese and their handful of sheep. I would have them know I am not a hard man. But I will not have the dead hand of the past, nor the sentiment of the present, set against the plain warrant of an instrument older than this hall." There was a murmur at that, half approval and half unease, and Honora saw old Grizzle Lound near the door press her chapped hands together, and the lame shepherd Eli Murrow look down at the rushes on the floor, as though the floor had already been taken from beneath him. She did not let herself look long. Beside her, Tobias Hartley stood very straight in his plain coat, his face the still, attentive face of a man on a quarterdeck waiting out the slow approach of an enemy sail, and when his hand found the edge of her sleeve for the briefest pressure she steadied, and remembered what they had built, piece by piece, in the cold of the foundry through the long nights of that fortnight, and she stepped forward when Sir Marmaduke, peering, asked who appeared to oppose the petition. "I do, sir." Her voice did not carry as Stourton's had. She had not been trained to make it. But the very quiet of it pulled the room toward her, and she led it. "Honora Vane, of Hollow Cross." I am the niece of Gideon Vane, master founder, lately dead, and I am the keeper of his ledgers. I do not oppose Mr. Staunton's right to what is his. I oppose his proof. I say the charter is good parchment and bad faith. I say the seal is bell metal cast in our own time and dressed to look old. And I say the bells upon that trestle were never founded in the reign of the 3rd Edward, but within the memory of men yet living. And I have brought the men, and the records and the bells themselves to prove it to your ears. Staunton smiled, the patient smile of a man indulging a child. The lady is the disappointed legatee of a cracked old foundry and a chest of a tradesman's scribblings. The county knows her grief has been. The county, said a dry, cool, carrying voice from the side of the hall, will hear her. Every head turned. Lady Quorn had come in unannounced through the justice's door, upright as a fire iron in her old-fashioned black, leaning upon an ebony stick, with Hartley's letter of 3 days past no doubt still folded somewhere about her. And she came down the side of the hall and took the chair that a flustered usher dragged forward, and she looked at her grandson with eyes like 2 chips of flint. "Sit down, Aurelian," she said. "I have travelled 40 miles on bad roads to hear this, and I will hear it to the end. Sir Marmaduke, I am the holder of the Quorn estate in fee. My grandson petitions in my family's name. I should be obliged if the court would let the woman speak, that I may know in whose name I am being made to stand." It was, Honora thought afterward, the moment the ground first truly shifted, for Sir Marmaduke, who feared gout and tedium but feared Lady Quorn rather more, waved his swollen hand and said, "Let her be heard." Briefly, mistress, she had been coached, by Hartley and by Dr. Wren both, to let the evidence speak and to keep herself small behind it, and she did. She called Jotham Crisp first. The old bell hanger came forward in his Sunday coat, frightened of the dice and the gentry but not of the bells, and when Honora asked him gently whether he knew the treble upon the trestle, he went to it like a man greeting an old dog and laid his seamed hand upon its waist. "Aye," he said, "I know her. I helped hang her. I were prentice to old Markin, the berry founder, and we cast this ring, this treble and her sister's, in the wet spring of the year 61, that were the year my own girl were born, and she's married now with grandchildren of her own. We cast 'em, and we carted 'em out by the witching road in the rain, and we hung 'em in St. Botolph's tower, where the old cracked medieval ring had been took down for scrap. I were 23. I'm gone 80 now." He looked up, and his rheumy eyes were suddenly steady. "I'll swear it on the book. These bells are no older than I am, sir, and I am old, but I am not 500. He is a confused old laborer," said Staunton, but there was the first thin thread of something else under the velvet now. "Primed by an interested woman. Then let us not rest on his memory alone," said Honora, "but on the metal," and she called Dr. Ambrose Wren. The antiquary rose with the relish of a man who has spent a long life being right and being ignored, and now finds himself, for once, both right and listened to. He had brought his own scales and a small file and his loop, and Honora had won him not by deference, but by out-reading him on alloy and tuning mark, until he had set down his teacup and looked at her with frank, astonished respect. And now he repaid her by being merciless. He took up the treble's inscription under his glass and read it aloud, the Latin and the date in Roman numerals worked into the black letter band, and then he turned the bell upon its trestle and showed the court the founder's mark stamped beside it. A small device, a bell within a lozenge, with the initials IP. "This mark," said Dr. Wren, "is the mark of the house of Pidle and Pankin of Bury St. Edmunds. I have studied the bell founders of this country for 30 years, and I will stake my name upon it. This mark does not appear upon any bell, in any tower, before the year 1740, for the house that used it was not founded until then. To find it upon a bell dated 1330 is as though you found a clockmaker's trade card of King George's reign sewn into the lining of a crusader's surcoat. The thing condemns itself. He set down the loop and took up his file, and with a glance at Honora and a nod of permission from the bench he drew it, once, twice, across the inside of the bell's sound bow where the metal was clean, and caught the bright filings on a square of paper and held them to the light. And the alloy. Honest old church bell bronze of the 14th century runs lean in tin, 3-4 parts in 20, no more. They could not better it. This metal is rich, 6 parts, near enough, by color and by ring and by the very way it takes the file. It is the bronze of a later, surer age. It is, in particular, and here he paused and let the silence draw out, it is the precise rich alloy that the late Gideon Vane recorded in his own ledger as the recipe of the Barry house, what he called, in his private notes, the new bronze. I have read his book. The court may read it too. And so the ledger came onto the table at last, Gideon's life laid open, page upon page of his cramped brown hand, the founding years and the alloys and the tuning marks filed into every sound bow for 60 miles, and the small private cipher of dots and strokes by which he had marked, year upon silent year, the bells he knew to be false. Honora turned to the St. Bodolph peal in the ledger and showed the court the entry, the true date, 1761, the Barry mark, the new bronze, and beside it, in her uncle's hand, the little broken constellation of dots that was his word for forged. And then she did the thing they had argued over longest in the cold of the foundry, the thing Hartley had feared and Dr. Wren had hungered for. She had Staunton's own seal weighed and filed in open court, and it answered to the same rich modern bronze as the bells, struck, as Wren now demonstrated, matching the grain of the metal from the same melt. The charter might be old parchment. Men could find old parchment, but its seal, the one thing meant to bind it past all doubt to the age it claimed, was cast from the self-same illicit pot as the lying peel. Staunton was no longer smiling. He had begun, in the careful way of a man whose footing is going from under him, to talk of the unreliability of the file, of the prejudice of disappointed relations, of the impertinence of a tradesman's private superstitions set against the gravity of an instrument, and the bench, which an hour ago had been his, listened to him now with the cooling, sidelong attention of men who smell a wreck. But Honora knew that metal and marks were a matter for experts, and that experts could be made to seem to quarrel, and that what she needed was a thing no man in the hall could dispute, because every man in the hall would judge it for himself with the one instrument none of them could be argued out of. She needed their ears. "Sirs," she said, "you have heard the founder who hung these bells, and the antiquary who has weighed them. You need not take their word, nor mine. My uncle taught me, when I was a child no higher than this table, that you cannot lie to a true ear. A bell sings the age it was born in, because the note a bell sings is fixed by its size and its shape and its metal, and the men of the 14th century could not tune as we tune now. They cast by guess and prayer, and let the note fall where it would, and their bells are sweet and various and never quite true. But these," she laid her hand upon the treble, "these were tuned, filed to a modern scale, in a modern shop, by men who could read a tuning fork. And I have here a bell to prove it." Then Jotham Crisp lifted the sacking from the small new witness bell they had cast together in the foundry by night, a foundling thing no bigger than a milk pail, founded in Gideon's true bronze and tuned, hammer blow by hammer blow against the template Honora had found in the chest's false bottom, to the very note her uncle's ledger gave for the false St. Botolph treble. She hung it on its little iron carriage beside the great brown ancient-seeming treble on the trestle, and she took up a wooden tuning mallet, and she looked once at Tobias Hartley, who gave her the smallest nod, the nod of a man watching a gun laid true, and she struck the old bell, and let it sing and die, and then she struck the new one. The same note, not near, the same. The two strokes fell into the hush of the moot hall and lay over one another like two prints of the same foot, like one voice answered by its own echo across a span of 450 years that did not exist. A bell that pretended to the reign of Edward, and a bell cast last Thursday in a derelict foundry, ringing as one because they were of one age and one metal and one maker's tuning. And every ear in that crowded hall, the gentry and the magistrates and the weavers and the fen folk, heard it and could not unhear it. Somebody at the back let out a breath that was almost a sob. Old Crisp had tears standing in his eyes. Dr. Wren had shut his own eyes to listen, and now he opened them and looked at Honora as a man looks at a sunrise. And Sir Marmaduke Quinnell, who had wanted brevity, leaned slowly forward over his gouty foot and said, in a voice gone quite different from the one he had begun with, "Strike them again, mistress, that the court may be sure." She struck them again. The hall heard the centuries collapse a second time. After that it was, in truth, very quick, the way the breaking of a long frost is quick. Lady Quorn rose, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not need to. "I have heard enough to be ashamed," she said, "and I am not a woman much given to shame. The bells lie, and they lie in my name, and the seal lies, and the charter that hangs upon that seal is not worth the staff it is rolled on. I disclaim it. I disclaim every word of the petition my grandson has brought, and I will instruct my attorneys to say so under my hand before nightfall. The Quorn estate makes no claim upon Witching Fen. It never had one worth the casting." She turned her flint eyes upon Aurelian Storton, who had gone the color of tallow. "You forged your ancestors, sir. I had 24 of them, honest and dull, and not one of them ever needed to be invented. Get out of my family's name. The rest belonged to the law and to ruin." Mr. Fenwick, the attorney magistrate, scenting now not a gentleman to please but a fraud to be seen punishing, asked the cold short questions that brought out the rest of it. The melt at a Lynn Brazier's that had cast both seal and peel, traced through the very tradesmen's bills Hartley had quietly gathered, the money Storton's late father had paid old Gideon Vane to keep his silence, read now aloud in the hush, so that the dead founder seemed to speak across his grave and damn the whole long lie. The debts and the speculations in fen drainage shares that had made the enclosure not a gentleman's antiquarian whim, but a drowning man's grasp. By the time the November dusk came gray to the tall windows, Aurelian Storton stood bound over upon recognizances to answer at the assizes for forgery and for uttering a forged instrument, his charter impounded. His credit gone, his county friends discovering business elsewhere, and within the month he had taken what was left to him across the water to Boulogne, and Witching Magna saw his handsome face no more. But that was the cold tale of it, and it is not where this story chooses to rest. It rests, as it began, in the foundry, for the formula of these tales is the turning of the world right way up. The unpaid drawing mistress made the mistress of something true. The ornament proved an authority. The dowerless spinster shown to be the one soul in 3 parishes who could read a bell by its note and its weight and be believed. They kept the fen. It was confirmed common at the very same sessions, by the very same bench. And Grizzle Lound put her geese back upon it that same week, and Eli Murrow drove his small flock out over the autumn grass with his lame man's lurching stride, and his face turned up to the rain like a man who had not known until that hour that the rain still fell for him too. And Hollowcross woke. Honora took it in her own hand, master founder of Hollowcross as her uncle had been, and old Jotham Crisp came to her as foreman because, he said, a man could not lie idle who had heard what he had heard in the moot hall, and the village sent her its boys to prentice, and by the spring the casting pit that had stood cold for years ran gold again, and the yard that had held only cracked and rejected bells began to fill instead with good ones, true-tuned, signed with a new mark she designed herself, a bell within a vein, for the wind and for her name. Tobias Hartley had been offered the sea, in those last hard days, a captaincy at last, and a posting far off, the very vindication the unjust court-martial had stolen from him years before. He had turned it down upon the moot hall steps before the verdict was even cold, and when Honora, terrified still of being a burden, had tried in her stumbling way to release him to it, he had simply taken both her cold ink-stained hands in his and said that he had spent a career being given orders by men who could not read a chart and would not be told, and that he was done now with men who could not be told, and meant to spend the rest of his life with the one person he had ever met who would rather know a true thing than be flattered by a false one if she would have him. She had it. Of course she had it. They were married at St. Botolph's in the green of the following June, a year almost to the day from the dinner where Stourton had first patronized her over the soup, and the church was full, the Pellews among them, Drusilla stiff and Septimus sheepish, and both of them anxious now to be remembered as having always known dear Honora would come to something, and Honora let them be reconciled at the edges of her life, because she had no more use for the keeping of grudges than her uncle had had for the keeping of false bells. Lady Corn came, wry and upright, and gave the bride away in default of any better vein, and made it known about the county that she considered the founder of Hollowcross her particular friend, which did Honora's order book no harm at all. And up in the tower over their heads, when the parson had done and the register was signed, there hung a new ring of bells, the false peal taken down at last and sold honestly for scrap, and in its place a true peal that Honora Hartley had cast and tuned with her own hand and her own ear. 6 bells that rang the age they were truly born in and were not ashamed of it, and when they were rung out over the wool town for her wedding the whole valley heard, for the first time in living memory, St. Botolph's tell the truth. And the story closes as it opened in gold light. It is a foundry afternoon some years on. The great doors of Hollowcross open to the warm slant of a westering sun, the casting pit cooling from the morning's pour. Tobias is at the long bench with the order book, in his shirt-sleeves, content as a man who has at last found the harbor he was always steering for. Old Crisp is teaching a long-legged prentice how to swing the tuning iron. And there is a child, their child, a small grave girl with foundry loam gray at the hem of her frock, exactly as her mother once was, kneeling at the lip of a new tenor bell that has just come from the cope, and she has pressed her ear flat to the warm bronze the way she has been shown, the way the bell asks to be listened to, unafraid, and Honora stands and watches and does not call her away, because the child has tilted her head and frowned and is reaching, all on her own and before the iron has so much as touched it, for the true note that is waiting inside. Mistress of Hollowcross, keeper of the ledgers, founder and tuner of true bells, the only soul in 3 parishes who could read a bell by its note and its weight and be believed. And now she sees. Not the only one for long. She smiles, and the light holds, and somewhere over the fen the bells are ringing the hour, and they are ringing it true.